For most of human history, nothing important was written down. No books, no notes, no libraries waiting quietly on shelves. And yet people still remembered where the water was during dry seasons, which plants healed sickness, which paths led safely through forests, and which stories explained who they were. Entire generations carried knowledge, without paper, without screens, without permanent records of any kind. What is difficult to imagine is that the human brain may not have been designed to store information the way we do now. Memory was once something alive. It moved through voices, rituals, songs, repeated journeys, and long nights beside firelight. Forgetting could mean hunger, exile, or death. Today, most people cannot remember even a few phone numbers without assistance from a machine. Somewhere across thousands of years, humans slowly traded internal memory for external memory. But if writing changed the way humans remember, what kind of mind existed before writing ever appeared? For most of human history, there was nowhere to place a thought outside the human mind. No paper resting quietly inside homes. No written instructions surviving untouched across generations. No shelves filled with records waiting patiently for future readers. If something needed to be remembered, it had to remain alive inside people themselves, carried carefully through repetition, conversation, routine, and shared experience. Memory was not separate from life then, it moved continuously through it. A hunting group, crossing open grasslands thousands of years ago, could not stop to search for forgotten information later, because nothing existed outside the minds of living people. The location of water during dry seasons, the behavior of migrating animals, the timing of colder winds, the plants that healed sickness, the places that became dangerous after heavy rain, all of it depended on human beings continuing to remember. Modern life feels very different because memory now surrounds people externally. Phones remember numbers, maps remember directions, photographs preserve faces. Search engines store information that no individual carries personally anymore. Most people no longer experience memory as something fragile, because machines now continue remembering even when human attention fades. Early humans did not have that kind of protection. Memory had to stay active constantly, or it disappeared. Children learned slowly by staying close to older members of their group, watching movements repeatedly until patterns became familiar enough to survive inside the body itself. Knowledge was rarely separated into abstract lessons because survival information worked best when attached directly to action. A person learning how to shape stone tools remembered through the hands before the mind could fully explain the process in words. A traveler remembered landscapes by walking through them again and again across changing seasons. Fishermen remembered water through movement, weather, sound, and repeated observation. Memory stayed tied to physical experience because there was no stable external system capable of preserving large amounts of information independently. This may explain why repetition became so deeply embedded in ancient human life. The same paths were walked repeatedly, the same stories returned night after night beside firelight. Songs, rituals, warnings, and family histories were spoken again and again because repetition protected knowledge from vanishing. In oral societies, remembering was not treated as a separate intellectual exercise the way modern education often treats memorization today. Memory existed naturally inside work, movement, relationships, ceremonies, and survival itself. Even identity depended heavily on continuous remembering. Names of ancestors survived because communities kept speaking them aloud. Stories about migrations, conflicts, births, deaths, alliances, and disasters remained alive only through repeated retelling across generations. In many ancient societies, forgetting did not simply mean losing information. It could mean losing orientation, trust, belonging, or safety. A forgotten route might separate a group from water. A forgotten season could lead hunters into scarcity. A forgotten agreement between neighboring groups could slowly damage cooperation that once protected both sides. And yet, despite how fragile this system may seem now, humans depended on it successfully for tens of thousands of years. Long before writing appeared, oral cultures carried astonishing amounts of knowledge across generations, using nothing but memory, speech, rhythm, and repetition. Histories survived this way. Navigation systems survived this way. Ecological knowledge survived this way. Spiritual traditions survived this way. Everything depended on continuity between living minds because knowledge could never rest permanently anywhere else. It had to keep moving from person to person before silence finally erased it. Forgetting was once far more dangerous than it feels today. Because modern people live surrounded by systems that continue remembering even after human attention disappears, with phones carrying numbers that no longer need to live inside memory, photographs preserving faces long after natural recall begins fading, maps remembering roads automatically, and machines quietly storing information without requiring constant repetition to keep it alive. But ancient humans lived without any form of external memory capable of protecting knowledge once living people stopped carrying it, and this meant that forgetting could slowly become physical, entering everyday life through hunger, injury, confusion, isolation, or death. Because a group traveling across unfamiliar land during a dry season could survive only if someone remembered where water remained after rivers began shrinking, hunters depended on remembered migration patterns, gathered across many years of observation, and the difference between medicine and poison sometimes depended on whether a plant was remembered correctly or confused with another that looked similar in dim light or exhaustion, while nature itself offered no pause for uncertainty, no opportunity to reopen lost information later. Since storms still arrived when expected signs were missed and winter still hardened the land, whether humans remembered its rhythms accurately or not, which may help explain why repetition became woven so deeply into ancient human life, with the same stories returning beside fires over countless nights, the same rituals repeated across seasons, the same songs carried from older voices into younger ones, because repetition strengthened memory against erosion and allowed important knowledge to remain active inside communities long enough to survive across generations. And in oral societies, remembering was rarely separated from ordinary movement through life itself, because people learned by walking familiar routes repeatedly, by watching older hands shape tools again and again, by observing which sounds in darkness signaled danger before danger became visible, by noticing how certain winds arrived before heavy rain, or how animal behavior shifted before colder weather, until memory settled into the body so deeply that knowledge often felt less like stored information and more like instinct formed slowly through repetition and attention, while older members of a community carried enormous importance, not simply because of age, but because experience itself became a living archive of environmental patterns gathered across decades, with some people remembering floods younger generations had never witnessed, unusual winters that changed migration routes, illnesses that spread during certain conditions, or distant paths that once led groups safely through scarcity. And long before written records existed, human survival depended heavily on these memories, traveling successfully from one generation into another without breaking apart along the way. Yet human memory has never been perfectly stable, because modern neuroscience suggests that memory is reconstructive rather than exact, meaning people rebuild the past each time they remember it, instead of replaying flawless recordings. So ancient humans also lived with gradual distortion, fading details, altered stories, and incomplete recollections that could slowly shift across generations unless communities protected important knowledge carefully through collective repetition, shared ceremonies, rhythm, correction, and routine, perhaps because humans understood long before writing that silence itself could erase things, not suddenly but gradually, the way an unattended fire slowly weakens through the night, until warmth disappears completely and darkness quietly takes its place. The human brain that existed before writing was not biologically different from the brain inside modern humans today, yet the way it was used may have felt profoundly different, because ancient people lived in environments where memory could not be separated from survival, and where information had to remain active inside the mind instead of resting safely outside the body, which meant attention itself carried a different kind of weight, since forgetting important details was not merely inconvenient but potentially dangerous in ways that modern people rarely experience anymore. And over thousands of years, human beings adapted culturally to this condition by building lives filled with repetition, observation, rhythm, and constant interaction with the physical world around them. So memory became deeply connected to movement, sound, place, and social relationships, rather than isolated acts of mental storage, while today many forms of remembering have been transferred outward into written language, digital devices, and automated systems that quietly preserve information without requiring continuous rehearsal from the individual mind. A person living thousands of years ago may have spent far more time observing small environmental changes because survival depended on noticing patterns that modern people often ignore completely, including subtle differences in animal movement, seasonal winds, cloud formations, river behavior, distant sounds during the night, or the appearance of stars across certain times of year. And because these observations were repeated continuously across daily life, they slowly formed durable memory structures tied directly to lived experience rather than abstract categories, which may help explain why oral cultures often developed astonishing abilities for retaining long sequences of information through story, rhythm, and association, not because ancient humans possessed magical memories, but because their environments constantly trained memory through necessity and repetition. Modern neuroscience suggests that the brain remembers more effectively when information becomes emotionally meaningful, physically repeated, socially reinforced, or attached to vivid sensory experience, and many ancient traditions naturally use these exact conditions to preserve knowledge long before scientific language existed to describe the process, with stories carrying emotional weight, rituals providing repetition, songs creating rhythm, and landscapes acting almost like physical memory maps that triggered recall through movement and familiarity. So, remembering was rarely treated as a detached intellectual task, because memory remained woven into ordinary existence itself. Even the structure of attention may have felt different in worlds without writing, because written language allows humans to store extremely detailed information externally and revisit it later with precision, while oral cultures depended more heavily on continuous mental engagement in the present moment, requiring people to actively maintain knowledge through use, instead of assuming it could safely wait elsewhere until needed again. And over time, this may have shaped habits of listening, observing, and recalling that modern societies gradually weakened as written systems became more widespread. Some historians and cognitive researchers have suggested that writing changed not only civilization but the internal experience of thought itself, because once information could exist permanently outside the mind, humans no longer needed to memorize certain kinds of detail with the same intensity as before, allowing attention to shift toward analysis, comparison, categorization, and large systems of abstract knowledge that would have been difficult to maintain purely through oral transmission. Yet something quieter may also have faded during that transition, since external memory reduced the pressure to carry knowledge internally through constant repetition and direct human connection. In many ancient societies, memory lived inside relationships between generations because younger people learned by remaining physically close to older people for long periods of time, listening repeatedly to stories, instructions, and observations until they became inseparable from ordinary life, whereas modern memory often feels solitary and outsourced, scattered across devices that remember independently of the human beings using them. And perhaps this is one reason the ancient world can feel psychologically distant now, because before writing, humans did not simply store memory differently, they inhabited memory differently, carrying much larger portions of their world continuously inside themselves as they moved through it. Long before roads were marked on paper or seasons were tracked on calendars, humans learned to remember the world by moving through it slowly enough for the land itself to become part of memory, and for early communities, this relationship with landscape was not poetic or symbolic in the modern sense, but deeply practical, because survival depended on recognizing patterns hidden inside rivers, forests, coastlines, mountains, winds, animal behavior, and changing light across the year. So remembering the environment became one of the oldest forms of human knowledge, carried not through written description but through repeated physical experience that slowly shaped the mind over time. A person crossing the same valley year after year would begin noticing details almost invisible to outsiders, including where cold air settled before winter fully arrived, where animals tended to gather during dry months, which plants appeared first after rainfall, or how certain stars aligned above distant hills before seasonal migration began. And these observations were rarely memorized as isolated facts, because they remained connected to movement, routine, and direct sensory familiarity, with memory growing stronger each time the body returned to the same places again. Modern people often experience geography through maps that flatten landscapes into symbols viewed from a distance, but ancient humans experienced landscapes from inside them through walking, listening, touching, waiting, and repeating journeys across many years, until memory and environment became closely intertwined. This may explain why many oral cultures around the world developed strong traditions connecting stories to physical locations, because places themselves helped trigger recall in ways similar to how certain smells or sounds can unexpectedly return forgotten memories even today, and by attaching knowledge to recognizable rivers, cliffs, trees, caves, or pathways, Communities created mental structures capable of preserving large amounts of practical information without writing anything down. Anthropologists studying indigenous Australian songlines, for example, have observed systems in which songs map enormous distances across the landscape, embedding navigation, survival knowledge, and cultural memory directly into repeated oral performance tied to specific routes, while other oral societies used landmarks, seasonal ceremonies, or repeated migrations to reinforce environmental memory generation after generation, not because these people lacked intelligence sophisticated enough for writing, but because their memory systems evolved within worlds where movement through the land remained central to survival itself. Seasons were especially important because ancient humans lived far closer to environmental cycles than most modern populations do today, meaning small seasonal changes could affect food availability, migration timing, shelter preparation, and long-term safety. So remembering when rivers flooded, when ice weakened, when animals reproduced, or when edible plants emerged, often determined whether groups remained healthy through difficult periods. And over time, these seasonal rhythms became deeply embedded inside ritual, storytelling, and communal activity because repetition strengthened collective memory against uncertainty. In many ancient societies, the year was not experienced through numbered dates, but through recurring environmental signs remembered collectively, such as the arrival of certain birds, the flowering of particular plants, the movement of fish, or the position of stars before dawn, allowing memory to remain tied directly to observable reality instead of abstract systems detached from the natural world. Even today, traces of this older relationship with memory still survive quietly inside human behavior, because many people can recall childhood places with surprising emotional clarity decades later, remembering not only visual details but sounds, temperatures, smells, and feelings connected to those environments, suggesting that the human brain still forms especially durable memories when experience becomes attached to place and repeated sensory exposure. Before writing existed, ancient humans depended on this connection constantly, carrying maps inside memory rather than on paper, learning the world not as detached information, but as lived terrain repeated so often that the landscape itself slowly became a form of memory storage, moving silently alongside them through time. Much of what ancient humans remembered was never spoken as formal instruction because survival knowledge often became invisible inside repetition, hidden within ordinary actions, repeated so consistently that people stopped separating memory from behavior itself. And this may be one of the greatest differences between modern learning and ancient learning, since modern societies frequently divide information into explicit categories that can be written down, tested, stored, and retrieved later, while oral societies often preserved knowledge by embedding it directly into daily life until repetition transformed necessary behaviors into habits that felt natural rather than consciously memorized. A child growing up in a hunting community thousands of years ago might follow older members through forests or grasslands for years before fully understanding everything being observed. Yet during that long process, the brain would quietly absorb countless patterns through repeated exposure, including how footsteps changed sound on different ground, how animals reacted to shifts in wind direction, which clouds signaled sudden weather changes, or how silence itself sometimes indicated danger nearby. And because these experiences occurred continuously, rather than through isolated lessons, memory formed gradually through immersion instead of deliberate study. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have often noted that practical knowledge is commonly learned through participation and repetition rather than verbal explanation alone, partly because repeated physical involvement strengthens long-term memory far more effectively than detached information does, and modern neuroscience supports this idea by showing that repeated actions connected to emotion, sensory input, and social interaction tend to create stronger neural pathways over time. Ancient humans may not have understood the biology behind memory formation, but their ways of living often aligned closely with how human memory naturally works best. Repetition also created stability in unpredictable environments because the natural world changes slowly enough that patterns become visible only through long observation repeated across seasons and generations. So communities developed routines that reinforced memory constantly without requiring formal systems of storage, including repeated migration routes, repeated hunting practices, repeated ceremonies tied to environmental cycles, and repeated storytelling attached to moments of communal gathering, all of which helped important knowledge remain active instead of fading through neglect. Even language itself sometimes carried memory more effectively when shaped through repetition, rhythm, and predictable structure, which may explain why many oral traditions around the world rely heavily on patterned speech, poetic phrasing, chants, or songs that make large amounts of information easier to retain across long periods of time, because the human brain naturally remembers sequences more reliably when sound, rhythm, and emotion work together instead of existing separately. In this kind of world, forgetting became less likely, not because individuals possessed perfect memories, but because communities designed life itself around constant reinforcement. Important knowledge appeared repeatedly in movement, conversation, ritual, labor, and seasonal activity until memory no longer depended entirely on conscious effort. A person preparing tools before winter repeated techniques learned through years of observation. A traveler recognized familiar terrain because the route had been walked many times before. A parent repeated warnings once heard from older generations. Over time, these repeated behaviors formed shared structures of memory extending beyond single individuals, allowing groups to preserve practical understanding across centuries without written records. Modern people sometimes imagine oral societies as unstable because nothing was written down permanently, yet repetition itself acted almost like a living archive continuously maintained through participation rather than stored externally in objects. And while this system could still lose information through disruption, disease, migration, or death, it also created a deeply embodied relationship with knowledge that modern societies increasingly experience less often as memory becomes outsourced into technology. Today, many forms of information can remain untouched for years inside digital systems without disappearing, but ancient humans could not rely on passive storage because inactive memory weakened over time, which meant knowledge survived best when woven directly into ordinary existence, repeated so naturally and so consistently that remembering no longer felt separate from living itself. Movement helped memory survive because the human brain remembers experience more deeply when knowledge is connected to physical action, and for most of human history, people learned while moving continuously through real environments rather than sitting apart from them, which meant memory formed not only through thought, but through walking, carrying, climbing, hunting, gathering, listening, and repeating familiar routes across many years until landscapes themselves became part of the remembering process. A person crossing the same river valley every season would slowly begin noticing details too subtle to explain fully in words, including how certain birds arrive before rainfall, how the ground changed texture before colder weather, or how animal tracks appeared differently after strong winds. And because these observations returned again and again through direct movement rather than isolated instruction, memory became tied to bodily experience in ways that modern written learning often does not require anymore. Cognitive scientists today understand that spatial memory and movement are deeply connected inside the brain, with regions such as the hippocampus playing important roles in navigation, orientation, and memory formation, which may help explain why ancient humans, living in constantly shifting natural environments, often developed remarkably detailed mental maps without relying on written records or visual diagrams. Before maps existed on paper, people carried geography internally through repeated travel, and these internal maps were rarely static because they evolved through ongoing interaction with changing terrain, weather, and seasonal patterns, allowing movement itself to strengthen memory each time familiar paths were traveled again. Many oral cultures around the world preserved knowledge by attaching stories, songs, or rituals directly to journeys across landscapes, so remembering became inseparable from physical motion, with each landmark triggering another sequence of memory along the route, almost like stepping through connected rooms inside the mind. Anthropologists observing indigenous Australian songlines, Polynesian navigation traditions, and other oral systems have often noted that movement through space can function as a powerful memory structure because physical progression naturally organizes information into sequences the brain can retain more reliably over time. And although these traditions differ greatly across cultures, they reveal a broader human tendency to remember more effectively when knowledge remains connected to lived movement rather than detached abstraction. Even modern people still experience traces of this ancient relationship between motion and memory without always noticing it, since familiar walks often trigger forgotten thoughts unexpectedly. Certain roads can bring back emotions from earlier periods of life, and physical routines repeated long enough eventually become automatic in ways that feel deeper than conscious memorization alone. Ancient humans depended on this process constantly because movement was unavoidable in a world where survival required direct engagement with the environment every day. Hunters traveled across enormous distances following animal migrations. Gathering communities revisited seasonal food locations repeatedly. Coastal populations tracked tides and currents through observation, strengthened by continual physical presence near water. Nomadic groups remembered territories through repeated crossings over many generations until roots became embedded inside collective memory, almost like inherited instinct. In this kind of world, stillness could sometimes weaken memory because unused knowledge gradually faded when disconnected from action, which may be one reason oral societies often repeated important journeys ceremonially, even after roots became familiar, reinforcing memory before details could disappear completely. Modern societies increasingly separate memory from movement by allowing people to store directions externally inside devices that navigate automatically, reducing the need to maintain large spatial memories internally. Yet before writing and modern technology existed, movement itself acted almost like rehearsal for the mind, continuously renewing important knowledge through direct interaction with the world. Humans remembered because they walked the same ground repeatedly, watched the same skies repeatedly, crossed the same rivers repeatedly, and through this constant return, the landscape slowly entered memory so deeply that survival no longer depended only on what people knew intellectually, but on what their bodies had quietly learned through years of movement across the living world around them. Human beings may have turned information into stories because stories are easier for the mind to carry across time than isolated facts alone, and long before writing existed, people needed a way to preserve important knowledge inside memory systems fragile enough to disappear whenever repetition stopped. So information gradually became woven into narrative, emotion, rhythm, and imagery until remembering felt less like storing data and more like reliving experience through language. A warning about dangerous terrain could survive longer when attached to a memorable journey. Knowledge about seasonal change became easier to preserve when connected to ancestors, spirits, animals, or familiar characters moving through recognizable landscapes. Even practical survival lessons often entered memory more deeply when shaped into stories, because the human brain naturally pays closer attention to events filled with tension, movement, emotion, and consequence than to detached instruction presented without context. Modern neuroscience suggests that emotionally engaging experiences are often remembered more effectively than emotionally neutral information, and ancient humans discovered versions of this principle long before scientific language existed to explain it, gradually building oral traditions that transformed memory into something vivid enough to survive repeated retelling across generations. Around fires at night, stories allowed knowledge to move slowly from older minds into younger ones without requiring written systems, and because these stories were spoken repeatedly over many years, they also became social experiences tied to safety, belonging, identity, and continuity, making them even harder to forget. A child listening to the same story through many winters was not only hearing entertainment, but absorbing environmental knowledge, moral expectations, family history, and collective memory all at once, often without separating those layers consciously. This may explain why many oral traditions around the world contain patterns that seem designed specifically for memory preservation, including repetition, predictable structure, rhythmic phrasing, symbolic imagery, and recurring narrative sequences that help listeners anticipate what comes next, because predictability strengthens recall, while vivid imagery gives the mind something concrete to hold on to. In societies without writing, stories acted almost like living containers capable of carrying large amounts of information safely through time, as long as communities continued repeating them carefully enough. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have observed that storytelling often preserves far more than myth or entertainment alone, sometimes carrying ecological knowledge, migration histories, genealogies, navigation routes, social agreements, and practical survival information encoded subtly inside narrative form, which means that stories were not separate from reality in the way modern people sometimes assume, but deeply intertwined with how human communities organized memory itself. Even today, the human brain still reveals traces of this ancient preference because people often remember information more easily when it appears inside narrative structure rather than isolated abstraction, and many individuals can recall stories heard decades earlier while forgetting lists of disconnected facts learned much more recently, suggesting that storytelling aligns closely with natural memory processes shaped across thousands of years of oral life. Before writing, stories also solved another problem beyond simple retention because they allowed information to travel between generations without needing physical storage. And unlike objects that could be destroyed by weather, fire, migration, or decay, stories survived through living repetition as long as communities protected them through constant use. Yet this system also depended heavily on human continuity, because stories change slowly each time they pass through memory, with details sometimes expanding, fading, or shifting depending on circumstance, emotion, or cultural need, which meant oral traditions were never perfectly fixed, but remained alive and adaptive across time. Perhaps this is why stories became so central to early human existence, not merely because people enjoyed imagination, but because narrative gave fragile human memory a structure strong enough to survive in a world where nothing could be written down, and where forgetting too much could slowly erase entire pieces of human experience from the future, forever. Rhythm may have helped ancient humans remember, because the brain naturally responds to pattern, repetition, and emotional timing in ways that make information easier to retain across long periods of time. And long before writing systems existed, people slowly discovered that words carried differently when spoken with cadence, melody, or recurring structure, which may explain why songs, chants, prayers, poems, and ritual speech appear so consistently across oral cultures throughout human history. A sentence spoken once in ordinary conversation could easily fade, but words attached to rhythm often remained inside memory far longer because predictable sound patterns give the mind something stable to follow, almost like footsteps repeated along a familiar path. And modern neuroscience supports this idea by showing that repetition and rhythmic structure strengthen recall through repeated neural activation, especially when information is combined with emotional engagement and social participation. Ancient humans may not have understood the biology behind this process, yet they lived close enough to memory's limitations to recognize instinctively that rhythm helped knowledge survive. Around fires at night, stories told with pauses, repeated phrases, and musical cadence became easier for listeners to remember accurately and easier for future storytellers to repeat again later, allowing important knowledge to travel through generations, even in societies where nothing could be written permanently. Emotion also played a powerful role because emotionally charged experiences tend to leave stronger memory traces than emotionally neutral ones, which meant stories connected to fear, wonder, grief, belonging, danger, or survival often remained vivid long after ordinary events disappeared, and oral traditions frequently combined rhythm with emotion deliberately, turning memory into something felt physically as much as intellectually. A warning spoken plainly might be forgotten, but a story about ancestors surviving hardship, repeated with emotional intensity through song or ritual, could remain alive inside a community for centuries. This connection between rhythm and emotion may explain why many ancient ceremonies involved synchronized movement, drumming, chanting, or collective recitation, since repetition performed together strengthens both memory and social bonding at the same time, creating shared emotional experiences that become harder for individuals to lose independently. Anthropologists studying oral traditions have often observed that communities preserving large amounts of information without writing rarely rely on random narration alone, instead using highly structured forms of repetition that help stabilize important details across generations, including repeated sequences, recurring imagery, formalized phrasing, and musical elements that reduce the likelihood of major distortion over time. Even today, traces of these ancient memory systems remain visible because people still remember songs from childhood decades later with surprising accuracy while forgetting ordinary conversations from only a few weeks ago, suggesting that rhythm and emotional repetition continue shaping human memory much as they did thousands of years ago. Before external memory systems existed, this mattered enormously because information had to survive inside unstable biological minds, vulnerable to distraction, aging, fear, illness, and death. So, oral societies developed cultural habits that reinforced memory continuously through sound, movement, and collective participation, until remembering became woven directly into social life itself. Repeated ceremonies returned season after season, not simply because communities resisted change, but because repetition protected continuity in a world where silence slowly erased knowledge. The same chants echoed across generations because familiarity stabilized memory. The same emotional stories returned because emotional intensity strengthened recall. The same rhythms traveled through countless human voices because pattern made information easier to carry forward accurately enough for survival. Perhaps this is why so many ancient traditions sound repetitive to modern ears, shaped by written culture, because repetition was not artistic excess in oral societies, but a practical defense against forgetting, a way of strengthening fragile human memory before written symbols existed to preserve words independently from the living minds forced to carry them through time. Some oral traditions survived for centuries without writing because human communities developed careful ways of protecting memory collectively, repeating important knowledge so consistently across generations that stories, laws, genealogies, navigation systems, and spiritual teachings could remain recognizable long after the people who first spoke them had disappeared. And although modern societies often assume written language is necessary for preserving complex information accurately, anthropologists and historians have found many examples showing that oral cultures were capable of maintaining surprisingly stable traditions when repetition, social structure, and ritual reinforcement worked together continuously over time. In ancient India, enormous sections of the Vedas were transmitted orally for generations before eventually being written down, preserved through highly disciplined recitation methods that emphasized exact sound, rhythm, and sequence, because even small changes were considered important enough to correct immediately, while in West Africa griots carried long genealogies, political histories, and cultural memory through trained oral performance that connected communities to centuries of ancestry and historical continuity, and, across the Pacific Ocean, Polynesian navigators memorized vast networks of stars, currents, winds, and island routes without written maps, relying on repeated teaching and direct experience carried carefully between generations. These traditions survived not because human memory was flawless, but because memory became shared across entire communities rather than left to isolated individuals alone, meaning knowledge was repeated publicly, corrected collectively, and reinforced constantly through ritual, storytelling, music, movement, and social expectation until forgetting became more difficult. In oral cultures, information that mattered deeply to survival or identity rarely remained silent for long, because silence itself threatened continuity, so important stories returned repeatedly through ceremonies, seasonal gatherings, family teaching, and communal performance, allowing memory to renew itself continuously before details had time to fade completely. This may also explain why oral traditions often contain formal structures that seem repetitive to modern audiences shaped by written culture, including recurring phrases, repeated imagery, predictable sequences, and rhythmic language patterns that stabilize recall over long periods of time, because repetition acted almost like a protective framework, holding fragile human memory together against distortion and loss. Modern neuroscience suggests that memory becomes more durable when reinforced socially and emotionally, and many oral societies naturally embedded memory inside both conditions simultaneously, turning storytelling into a shared emotional experience that strengthened collective retention while also reinforcing belonging within the group. Yet oral traditions were never perfectly fixed in the way written records sometimes appear to be, because each retelling still passed through human minds, shaped by emotion, interpretation, fear, pride, and changing cultural circumstances, allowing details to shift gradually across generations, even when communities tried carefully to preserve continuity. Historians studying oral transmission often note that while central structures of important traditions may remain surprisingly stable over long periods, smaller details can change naturally over time, which means oral memory was both durable and alive at the same time, preserving continuity without becoming completely frozen. Before writing existed, this flexibility may actually have helped societies adapt knowledge to changing environments while still maintaining connection to the past. A story about migration could absorb new dangers across generations. A ritual tied to seasonal survival could shift gradually as climates changed. Memory remained active rather than static because living people carried it forward continuously. Modern humans sometimes imagine knowledge becoming safer once writing appeared, and in many ways it did, because written records allowed information to survive beyond the lifespan of individual memory. Yet oral traditions reveal that human beings had already developed remarkably sophisticated systems for preserving knowledge long before permanent writing emerged. Systems built not from paper or ink, but from repetition, sound, emotion, structure, and the deeply human need to remain connected to those who came before. Perhaps this is why some oral traditions still survive even now despite centuries of technological change, because beneath modern systems of external memory, the human brain continues responding to rhythm, story, and repetition much the same way it did thousands of years ago, quietly carrying traces of an older world where memory had to stay alive inside people or disappear forever. Rhythm is easier to remember because the human brain naturally looks for pattern inside sound, movement, and repetition, and long before writing existed, this tendency quietly shaped the way humans preserved knowledge across generations, allowing spoken words to survive more reliably when they moved with predictable timing instead of remaining flat and unstructured. A sentence spoken casually might disappear quickly from memory, but the same sentence repeated with rhythm, melody, or recurring phrasing often remains much longer because pattern gives the mind something stable to follow, almost like footsteps repeating along familiar ground. And modern neuroscience suggests that rhythmic repetition strengthens memory partly by activating connected neural pathways repeatedly over time, making information easier to retrieve later, even after long periods have passed. Ancient humans did not understand these biological mechanisms scientifically, yet they lived close enough to the fragility of memory to recognize through experience that rhythm helped protect words from fading. Around fires at night, stories spoken with cadence became easier for children to remember. Chants repeated during ceremonies remained stable because groups spoke them together again and again. Songs attached to seasonal work survived because melody carried structure into memory naturally without requiring written support. In oral societies, rhythm was not simply artistic decoration added to language for beauty alone. It was practical. It stabilized memory inside minds that had no external systems capable of preserving information permanently. This may explain why so many ancient traditions across very different cultures contain repetitive verbal patterns, including repeated openings, mirrored phrases, recurring imagery, and carefully balanced sound structures that guide listeners forward predictably while reinforcing recall at the same time. Even epic oral traditions that carried enormous amounts of information often depended heavily on rhythm and formulaic phrasing because structured language reduces the cognitive burden of remembering long sequences exactly. Researchers studying oral poetry and oral storytelling have observed that performers frequently rely on recurring rhythmic frameworks that help organize memory during performance, allowing vast narratives to be spoken without written reference, and in many cases these systems proved durable enough to survive for centuries through continuous repetition alone. Rhythm may also have strengthened memory because it engaged the body as much as the mind. Human beings naturally synchronize movement to repeated sound, whether through walking, clapping, dancing, rowing, or collective chanting. And when memory becomes connected to coordinated physical experience, it often grows more durable through sensory reinforcement. Ancient ceremonies frequently combined rhythm with movement, voice, and emotion simultaneously, creating deeply immersive experiences where information became difficult to separate from the feeling of participation itself. A child hearing the same rhythmic story every winter while sitting among familiar voices beside firelight would not only remember the words intellectually, but also the emotional atmosphere surrounding them. And emotional memory tends to remain especially strong because the brain prioritizes experiences connected to social belonging, danger, wonder, grief, or comfort. Even modern people still carry traces of this ancient relationship between rhythm and memory because songs learned decades earlier often remain accessible with surprising clarity while ordinary conversations disappear quickly, suggesting that the human brain continues responding to structured sound much as it always has. Before writing, this mattered enormously because communities could not rely on books waiting silently to preserve exact wording after speakers died. Words had to survive inside living memory, and rhythm helped reduce loss by turning language into something easier to repeat accurately across time. The same phrases returned across generations because familiarity strengthened recall. The same songs survived because melody carried memory forward when ordinary speech might fade. The same rhythmic prayers echoed repeatedly because repetition stabilized, meaning inside collective experience. Perhaps this is why oral cultures often sound repetitive to modern ears shaped by written language, because repetition was not weakness or simplicity, but a sophisticated adaptation to the limits of human memory in a world where forgetting too much could slowly erase history, identity, survival knowledge, and connection itself. Ceremonies may have helped preserve memory because they created moments that communities repeated together with enough consistency, emotion, and structure for important knowledge to remain alive across generations. And long before writing existed, these repeated gatherings became one of the most reliable ways humans protected stories, beliefs, survival practices, and social identity from slowly disappearing over time. In modern societies, ceremonies are often viewed mainly as symbolic or spiritual events, separated from practical knowledge. Yet, in many ancient cultures, ritual and survival were deeply connected because ceremonies reinforced the collective memory that communities depended on to remain stable. Seasonal gatherings reminded people when environmental changes were approaching. Funeral rituals preserved family continuity by repeating names, histories, and relationships aloud. Initiation ceremonies passed important cultural knowledge from older generations into younger ones through repeated instruction, embedded inside emotionally significant experiences. The more emotionally powerful a moment became, the more likely the brain was to remember it later, and modern neuroscience suggests that emotionally charged social experiences often strengthen long-term memory formation because the brain prioritizes information associated with belonging, danger, meaning, or shared attention. Ancient humans did not describe these processes scientifically, but many ritual traditions naturally aligned with the way human memory works best by combining repetition, emotion, sound, movement, and collective participation into single experiences repeated across long stretches of time. A story spoken casually one evening might eventually fade, but the same story repeated ceremonially every year within a structured communal setting could remain stable for centuries because repetition continually renewed memory before forgetting had time to fully weaken it. This may explain why oral societies often attached important knowledge to ritualized performance rather than ordinary conversation alone, since ceremonies created predictable frameworks where memory could be reinforced publicly and corrected collectively if details began shifting too far over time. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have often observed that rituals function partly as memory systems because they preserve shared structures of meaning inside repeated action, with songs, gestures, costumes, dance, and spoken phrases all working together to stabilize cultural continuity across generations. Even the physical environment surrounding ceremonies sometimes strengthened memory because sacred locations became associated repeatedly with particular stories, ancestors, or seasonal events, allowing place itself to trigger recollection through familiarity and emotional association. In this kind of world, memory did not survive privately inside isolated minds, but through repeated participation inside communal life. Children learned by observing ceremonies long before fully understanding them intellectually, gradually absorbing rhythms, symbols, expectations, and narratives through exposure, repeated year after year, until memory settled deeply into identity itself. Some ceremonies likely also served practical survival functions disguised within symbolic structure, preserving ecological knowledge, migration timing, food preparation practices, or social rules important for group stability, in ways that became easier to remember because they were emotionally meaningful and socially reinforced, rather than presented as detached information. Even today, traces of this older relationship between ritual and memory remain visible because people often remember weddings, funerals, holidays, songs, and repeated family traditions with unusual clarity compared to ordinary days that pass unnoticed, suggesting that the human brain still responds strongly to repeated ceremonial experience, much as it did thousands of years ago. Before writing, this mattered enormously because communities could not rely on external systems to preserve identity or continuity after older generations disappeared. Ceremonies acted almost like living archives repeatedly reopened through collective performance, allowing knowledge to survive not through silent storage, but through active renewal carried by human voices, bodies, emotions, and relationships. Perhaps this is why rituals persisted so strongly across ancient societies despite the effort they required, because beneath their spiritual or symbolic appearance they also protected something deeply fragile, the continuity of human memory itself, in a world where silence and neglect could gradually erase entire ways of understanding life from existence altogether. Collective repetition helped human memory survive because a community repeating the same knowledge together becomes far more stable than isolated individuals trying to remember alone. And long before writing existed, humans gradually built cultures where important information returned constantly through shared speech, shared movement, shared rituals, and shared stories, until memory itself became distributed across many minds, instead of resting inside one fragile person. In modern societies, memory often feels private, because information can be stored externally in books, devices, or digital systems that remain stable even when individuals forget. But ancient humans depended much more heavily on collective reinforcement because knowledge disappeared easily when left inactive for too long, and this meant communities developed ways of repeating important ideas publicly and repeatedly, so forgetting would become less likely across generations. A child growing up in an oral society might hear the same migration story every winter, the same ceremonial phrases during seasonal gatherings, the same warnings about rivers or hunting grounds from many different voices over many years, and through this repeated exposure, memory gradually strengthened, not only through individual recall, but through social continuity itself. If one person forgot part of a story, others could correct it. If details began shifting too far, communal repetition pulled the tradition back toward familiar structure. Anthropologists studying oral traditions have often observed that collective performance acts almost like a stabilizing force for memory, because repeated public narration reduces the chance that important information will drift uncontrollably over time, especially when stories, songs, or rituals are tied closely to group identity and survival. This may explain why many oral cultures place such strong emphasis on shared participation rather than passive listening alone, since memory grows more durable when people speak, sing, move, and respond together instead of receiving information silently in isolation. Modern neuroscience also suggests that social reinforcement strengthens memory formation because emotionally meaningful experiences repeated within groups activate attention and recall more deeply than detached information encountered alone. And ancient humans naturally lived inside highly social environments where learning occurred continuously through participation rather than separation. The same rhythms repeated through many voices, the same movements returned through many bodies. The same stories traveled through generations because communities kept them active collectively before silence had time to weaken them. In this kind of world, repetition was not viewed as unnecessary redundancy but as protection against disappearance. Important knowledge had to remain in motion constantly because memory itself was unstable. A law remembered only once could fade. A route traveled only once could be forgotten. A story spoken only once might disappear entirely after the death of the person carrying it. Collective repetition reduced this fragility by spreading memory outward across the social structure of the group, allowing continuity to survive even when individuals aged, died, or lost details over time. This may also be one reason ancient ceremonies, chants, and oral traditions often appear highly repetitive to modern audiences shaped by written culture, because written language allows people to revisit exact information later without needing constant rehearsal, while oral societies depended on continual repetition to maintain accuracy across generations. Even today, traces of this ancient system remain visible in ordinary human behavior because people still repeat songs together, celebrate recurring traditions, retell family stories, and preserve identity through shared rituals that strengthen memory socially rather than individually. A national anthem survives because millions continue singing it. Religious prayers survive because communities repeat them regularly. Family histories survive because older relatives continue telling them. Beneath modern technology, the human brain still responds to collective repetition much as it always has, finding stability in familiar patterns shared with others. Before writing, this process mattered enormously because memory could not survive passively inside objects waiting silently for future readers. It had to stay alive through human participation itself, renewed continuously through voices repeating together across long stretches of time, allowing fragile knowledge to endure in a world where forgetting too much could slowly dissolve not only information, but the continuity holding entire communities together. Before writing existed, knowledge could only survive inside living people, which meant that every community depended heavily on certain individuals who carried unusually large amounts of memory across long stretches of time. And in many ancient societies, these people became deeply important not because they possessed political power in the modern sense, but because they preserved continuity between generations in a world where information disappeared easily once human voices fell silent. An elder who remembered old migration routes, dangerous seasons, healing plants, ancestral stories, or agreements between neighboring groups carried something far more fragile than physical possessions, because if that knowledge vanished unexpectedly, it could leave younger generations facing the world with less understanding than those who came before. Modern people often assume information naturally survives somewhere outside the self, stored safely in books, archives, recordings, or digital systems. Yet ancient humans lived with the constant awareness that memory depended entirely on living continuity. A person dying without passing knowledge forward could create permanent absence. Entire techniques, stories, routes, and histories may have disappeared many times throughout human history simply because the last people carrying them were lost before teaching others successfully enough. This may help explain why older individuals often held such respected positions in oral societies, since age itself represented accumulated observation gathered slowly across decades of lived experience. Someone who had survived many winters remembered environmental changes younger people had never personally witnessed. They remembered unusual storms, animal behavior before scarcity, conflicts between groups, distant pathways, burial grounds, ceremonies, medicinal practices, and countless subtle details that could not be recovered once forgotten. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have often observed that memory in these societies functions collectively but still relies heavily on skilled individuals capable of preserving and transmitting large bodies of knowledge with consistency, including storytellers, navigators, healers, spiritual leaders, genealogists, and ritual specialists whose social roles depended partly on maintaining continuity between past and present. In West African traditions, griots preserved historical memory through oral performance, carrying genealogies and political histories across generations, while in many indigenous cultures, elders maintained ecological and spiritual knowledge tied closely to specific landscapes, seasonal rhythms, and communal identity, not because writing was unavailable due to lack of intelligence, but because oral systems evolved within worlds where human memory itself served as the primary archive. This created a different relationship between knowledge and human presence than most modern societies experience now. Today, information can survive independently from the people who created it. Ancient knowledge could not. A story remained alive only while someone continued telling it. A route remained usable only while someone still remembered how to travel it safely. A ceremony survived only while communities repeated it often enough for younger generations to absorb its meaning before older generations disappeared. Knowledge moved through relationships rather than through objects. Children learned by remaining close to experienced adults for long periods of time, watching repeated actions, listening to familiar stories, and slowly inheriting memory through ordinary participation in communal life. In many ways, learning before writing was less about accessing information and more about becoming connected deeply enough to living people that memory could pass between generations without breaking apart. Yet this system also carried vulnerability because humans are mortal. Memory changes naturally over time, and social disruption can weaken continuity quickly. Disease, migration, warfare, environmental collapse, or separation between generations could erase enormous amounts of accumulated knowledge in relatively short periods, which may be one reason oral societies often emphasized respect for elders so strongly, since preserving older voices helped protect the fragile continuity of collective memory itself. Even today, traces of this ancient structure remain visible because people still turn instinctively toward older family members when trying to recover forgotten histories, recipes, traditions, names, or stories that exist nowhere else, revealing that beneath modern systems of external storage, humans still understand something very old and very quiet, that certain forms of knowledge survive most deeply when carried inside living people rather than stored passively outside them. In societies without writing, memory often became a source of social authority because the people who carried important knowledge also carried the ability to guide decisions, preserve continuity, and explain the past in ways others could not easily replace. And this created communities where influence was tied not only to physical strength or material resources, but to the capacity to remember accurately across long stretches of time. A person who knew migration routes, seasonal patterns, ancestral histories, sacred rituals, healing practices, or agreements between neighboring groups possessed something essential for collective survival, because information could not simply be verified later through documents or stored records. Knowledge existed inside human beings themselves, which meant trust became deeply connected to memory. Younger generations depended on older voices to understand where they came from, how to survive difficult seasons, which rules protected social stability, and what mistakes previous generations had already learned through hardship. This may help explain why many oral cultures placed enormous respect around elders, storytellers, navigators, ritual leaders, and genealogists, not because these individuals controlled written institutions, but because they carried living access to the collective memory of the group. Anthropologists studying oral societies have often observed that authority in these communities frequently emerges through demonstrated knowledge preserved over time rather than through permanent ownership of written systems, and in many cases, the ability to recite histories, perform rituals correctly, interpret environmental patterns, or remember long genealogies became evidence of reliability and wisdom. In West African griot traditions, for example, oral historians preserved political memory and lineage continuity across generations, while in Polynesian navigation cultures, certain individuals maintained complex knowledge of stars, currents, and sea routes that entire communities depended on for survival across vast distances of open ocean, and because this knowledge could not exist independently from the people carrying it, memory itself became socially valuable in ways modern societies may struggle to fully recognize. Today, authority is often distributed through institutions, databases, legal systems, and written records that continue existing even after individuals disappear, but ancient oral societies relied far more heavily on human continuity, meaning the loss of knowledgeable individuals could create real instability inside communities. A healer dying without teaching medicinal knowledge forward might leave people vulnerable during future illness. A ritual leader forgetting ceremonial sequences could weaken traditions tying generations together. A navigator losing memory of distant routes could isolate entire groups geographically. This fragility encouraged cultures where listening carefully to experienced voices became necessary for survival rather than merely respectful behavior. At the same time, memory-based authority carried limitations because human recollection is never perfectly stable. Modern neuroscience suggests that memory changes subtly each time it is recalled, shaped continuously by emotion, interpretation, and context, which means oral authority always contained the possibility of distortion, disagreement, or gradual transformation over time. Different storytellers might emphasize different details. Historical events could shift slowly in meaning across generations. Collective memory could become influenced by present needs as much as past reality. Yet oral societies often developed communal correction systems that reduced uncontrolled change by repeating important stories publicly, where many listeners already knew familiar structures well enough to recognize major deviations. Authority therefore remained connected not only to memory itself, but to the community's shared participation in preserving continuity together. In many ways, this created a more relational form of knowledge than modern systems often encourage, because memory depended on ongoing interaction between generations rather than passive access to stored information. Children learned by spending years near knowledgeable adults, absorbing not only facts, but habits of attention, interpretation, storytelling, and observation that slowly shaped identity over time. Knowledge moved through human relationships instead of through silent objects. Even today, traces of this older structure remain visible because people still often trust lived experience differently from abstract information, turning instinctively toward older relatives, teachers, community figures, or cultural elders when searching for meaning, continuity, or guidance during uncertain moments. Beneath modern systems of written storage, humans still seem to recognize something ancient, that memory carried through living people possesses a kind of authority different from information preserved externally, perhaps because knowledge shaped by long experience feels connected not only to what is known, but to the human life that carried it across time. When elders died in societies without writing, entire worlds of memory could disappear with them, not suddenly in ways that were always visible immediately, but slowly, through absences younger generations might not fully recognize until much later, because before external systems existed to preserve information independently, knowledge remained tied to fragile human continuity and could vanish whenever the last people carrying certain experiences, stories, roots, or skills were lost before passing them forward completely enough for others to preserve. Modern people often assume important information naturally survives somewhere beyond individual lives, stored safely inside books, recordings, archives, or digital systems that remain accessible even after the people who created them are gone. Yet for most of human history, this kind of permanence did not exist, and memory had to survive through direct transmission between living minds without interruption. An elder who remembered old migration paths across difficult terrain might carry knowledge gathered slowly over decades of travel that younger members of the community had never experienced personally. Someone who understood how certain plants healed illness during rare environmental conditions might hold practical knowledge impossible to rediscover quickly, once forgotten. A storyteller preserving ancestral history might maintain connections between generations, stretching back far beyond the lifespan of any single person, allowing communities to understand who they were, where they came from, and why certain customs existed at all. When individuals like these disappeared unexpectedly through illness, conflict, famine, environmental disaster, or age before successfully transferring memory forward, knowledge sometimes vanished permanently. Anthropologists and historians studying oral cultures have noted that enormous amounts of human understanding have likely disappeared throughout history in exactly this way, including languages, ecological knowledge, ceremonial practices, navigation systems, oral histories, and local survival strategies that existed for generations, yet left little or no permanent trace once social continuity broke apart. Some indigenous communities around the world, for example, have described the death of elders not only as personal loss, but as the loss of libraries, because each person carried unique memories, interpretations, stories, songs, and environmental observations accumulated across an entire lifetime of experience. In oral societies, knowledge rarely existed in perfectly identical form across all members of a group. Different individuals remembered different details, specialized skills, or ceremonial responsibilities, which meant the disappearance of certain people could weaken parts of communal memory, even if the broader culture survived. This may help explain why many oral traditions placed such strong emphasis on teaching younger generations through repeated participation long before older members became physically weak, since communities understood that memory had to remain moving continuously or risk fading beyond recovery. Yet even careful repetition could not preserve everything forever, because human memory changes naturally over time. Details soften, languages shift, environmental conditions transform, communities migrate or separate. Modern neuroscience suggests that memory is reconstructive rather than fixed, meaning each act of remembering subtly reshapes the past through present perception, emotion, and interpretation. So oral traditions remained alive partly because they adapted gradually alongside changing human circumstances. But adaptation also meant some forms of older knowledge slowly disappeared while new experiences replaced them. Before writing, this process was unavoidable because there was no exact external record capable of freezing information permanently against time. Human continuity depended instead on living memory surviving through enough repetition, attention, and care to remain useful for future generations. Even today, traces of this ancient fragility still appear whenever older relatives pass away and families suddenly realize certain recipes, stories, names, songs, or histories existed nowhere else except inside the people who carried them quietly for decades. A voice disappears, and entire pieces of the past become unreachable. A death occurs, and details once repeated naturally through conversation vanish into silence. Perhaps this is one reason humans eventually placed such enormous value on writing once it emerged, because for thousands of years people lived with the constant understanding that memory could disappear forever if living chains between generations weakened even briefly, leaving parts of human experience to fade slowly out of the world with no way to fully recover them again. Long before humans drew maps on paper, landscapes themselves became maps held inside memory, and people learned to navigate the world not through written directions or visual diagrams, but through repeated movement across rivers, forests, coastlines, deserts, valleys, and mountains, until the environment slowly organized itself inside the mind as a living network of remembered relationships. A traveler crossing the same route many times over many years would begin noticing patterns too subtle for outsiders to recognize easily, including where sunlight reached certain cliffs first in the morning, How wind changed near water during seasonal shifts, which stars aligned above distant hills before migration periods began, or where animal tracks appeared most reliably after rainfall. And through this repetition, the landscape became more than scenery, because every physical feature started carrying memory connected to survival, orientation, history, and social meaning. Modern people often experience geography through external systems like maps, street signs, satellites, and digital navigation tools that separate information from direct sensory experience. But ancient humans depended far more heavily on internal spatial memory, built slowly through bodily movement and long familiarity with place. Cognitive science today suggests that the human brain contains specialized systems for navigation and spatial orientation, especially within regions such as the hippocampus, which help humans form mental maps through repeated interaction with environments over time, and this may help explain how oral societies were capable of navigating vast and complex territories without written records. Polynesian navigators crossed enormous distances across the Pacific Ocean by memorizing stars, currents, winds, cloud patterns, and ocean swells through direct observation repeated across generations, while indigenous Australian songlines connected stories and navigation into large oral networks that allowed people to travel long routes by remembering sequences tied to landmarks and movement itself. And in many ancient hunting or nomadic cultures, survival depended on similarly detailed internal maps, carried collectively inside human memory rather than stored externally in objects. Landscapes also helped stabilize memory because physical places trigger recall naturally. Even modern people often experience forgotten memories returning unexpectedly when revisiting childhood roads, buildings, forests, or coastlines associated with earlier periods of life, suggesting that the human brain remembers place with unusual emotional and sensory depth. Ancient humans depended on this relationship constantly because memory attached to physical terrain remained easier to retrieve than abstract information detached from lived experience. A mountain pass could remind travelers of seasonal dangers. A river bend could trigger stories about ancestors, hunting practices, or past migrations. A coastline could preserve generations of ecological observation through repeated interaction across centuries. In oral societies, landscapes often carried layers of memory simultaneously, functioning as routes, teaching systems, survival guides, historical archives, and spiritual markers all at once. This may be one reason many ancient cultures developed stories tied closely to specific locations, because narrative anchored to recognizable terrain becomes easier to preserve over long periods of time, especially when people physically revisit those places repeatedly across generations. Before writing existed, memory survived best when woven into ordinary movement through the world rather than separated into isolated information stored externally. A person remembered because they walked the same paths again and again, watched familiar landmarks through changing seasons, listened to repeated stories connected to those places, and gradually absorbed environmental patterns deeply enough that navigation no longer felt like conscious calculation, but like recognition, formed through years of lived experience. Yet these mental maps also remained fragile because they depended on continuity between people and place. Forced migration, environmental collapse, conflict, or cultural disruption could weaken memory quickly once communities lost regular contact with the landscapes carrying their collective knowledge. Routes forgotten for only a generation might become difficult to recover fully. Place names could disappear. Seasonal patterns once understood intimately could fade into uncertainty. Even today, many indigenous communities continue working to preserve land-based knowledge threatened by displacement and modernization, reminding modern societies that before written maps existed, humans carried geography inside memory itself, turning the living world into a vast mental archive that guided survival long before words were fixed permanently onto paper. Familiar places trigger memory so strongly because the human brain forms deep connections between physical environments and lived experience. And long before writing existed, this relationship helped ancient humans preserve enormous amounts of practical and emotional knowledge simply by remaining closely connected to the landscapes they moved through repeatedly across daily life. Modern neuroscience suggests that memory is not stored as isolated information, detached from context, but often linked together with sensory details, emotions, movement, and spatial awareness, which means places themselves can act like powerful cues that reactivate memories even after many years have passed. A person returning to a childhood home may suddenly remember sounds, smells, conversations, or emotions that seemed completely forgotten moments earlier, and this happens because the brain stores experience through networks of association rather than through perfectly separated categories. Ancient humans depended on this process constantly because their survival required continuous interaction with the same environments over long periods of time. A river crossing was never only a river crossing. It might also contain memories of seasonal flooding, successful hunts, dangerous storms, family stories, burial grounds, medicinal plants nearby, or lessons taught by older generations many years earlier, and each repeated visit strengthened those associations further until the landscape itself became filled with layered memory difficult to separate from physical place. This may help explain why so many oral traditions around the world connect stories directly to mountains, caves, coastlines, forests, pathways, or stars, because attaching knowledge to recognizable locations helps stabilize memory naturally through repeated environmental exposure. Anthropologists studying indigenous cultures have often observed that landscapes function not merely as physical territory, but as memory structures carrying history, navigation, identity, law, spirituality, and ecological knowledge simultaneously, with certain locations acting almost like living reminders that reactivate collective understanding each time communities return to them. In Australian Aboriginal songline traditions, for example, stories tied to specific routes across the land help preserve navigation and cultural memory together, while in many hunting societies, landmarks became associated with practical survival knowledge passed through generations by repeated travel and storytelling connected directly to those places. Before writing, this mattered enormously because physical environments provided continuity that human memory alone could not always maintain reliably. A familiar valley returned each season. A coastline remained recognizable across decades. A mountain stood unchanged while generations aged around it. These stable external features helped anchor fragile internal memory by giving the mind repeated sensory reference points capable of reactivating older knowledge whenever people encountered them again. Even modern cognitive science suggests that spatial memory and episodic memory are closely connected through brain systems involved in navigation and contextual recall, particularly within regions such as the hippocampus, which may explain why humans often remember experiences more vividly when tied strongly to place. Ancient humans likely strengthened these neural connections constantly through movement and repetition because they lived inside environments rather than interacting with them briefly or abstractly. A child learned not from diagrams or written explanations, but from repeated presence in real locations where memory formed through direct observation over many years. Knowledge about water sources came from returning repeatedly during changing seasons. Understanding animal migration came from physically watching landscapes transform over time. Social memory became attached to gathering places where stories and ceremonies returned generation after generation. In this kind of world, forgetting a place could mean forgetting the knowledge attached to it as well. Routes abandoned for too long became uncertain. Landscapes lost through migration or displacement could weaken collective memory because environmental cues supporting recall disappeared along with them. Even today, many displaced communities describe feeling that parts of cultural memory become harder to preserve once separation from ancestral land grows too large, suggesting that the ancient bond between place and memory remains deeply rooted inside the human mind. Before maps, books, or digital archives existed, familiar places helped humans remember, not by speaking directly, but by quietly holding patterns stable long enough for memory to return each time people walked through them again. Before writing existed, memory was often tied so closely to the land that separating knowledge from place would have felt almost impossible, because ancient humans did not experience information as detached data stored independently from the world around them, but as something continuously reinforced through direct contact with rivers, forests, coastlines, mountains, animal paths, weather patterns, and seasonal movement repeated across many years of life. A valley remembered by one generation became meaningful, partly because previous generations had already moved through it repeatedly, attaching stories, dangers, rituals, food sources, migration routes, and emotional experience to that terrain, until the landscape itself carried layers of accumulated human memory. Modern people often think of memory as something happening primarily inside the brain, yet for much of human history, remembering depended heavily on ongoing interaction between mind, body, community, and environment working together continuously. A person returning each year to the same fishing grounds would not only remember where fish gathered during different tides, but also recall storms that once struck unexpectedly there, stories told by older relatives during earlier journeys, and subtle environmental signs connected to safety or danger that became visible only through long familiarity. Knowledge survived because the land repeatedly triggered recall. A coastline could remind travelers when certain winds became dangerous. A mountain pass could reactivate memories about migration timing or ancestral journeys. A cluster of trees might preserve knowledge about water hidden nearby during dry seasons. In oral societies, these connections between memory and environment often became so deeply embedded that landscapes themselves functioned almost like external memory systems, even before formal writing emerged. Anthropologists, studying indigenous cultures across different parts of the world, have often noted that ecological knowledge, spiritual traditions, navigation systems, and historical memory are frequently inseparable from specific locations because repeated movement through those places continually renews collective understanding over time. Indigenous Australian songlines, for example, connect stories, geography, navigation, and cultural lore into oral pathways tied directly to physical terrain, while Arctic indigenous communities have historically preserved detailed environmental memory about ice conditions, animal behavior, and seasonal travel routes through repeated interaction with landscapes changing slowly across generations. These systems were not primitive substitutes for writing, but highly adapted forms of memory shaped by environments where survival depended on long-term observation and continuity between people and place. Modern neuroscience also suggests that memory retrieval often becomes stronger when linked to environmental context, meaning humans naturally recall information more effectively when sensory surroundings resemble earlier experiences connected to that knowledge, and ancient humans lived inside this principle constantly because their learning occurred within real environments instead of abstract classrooms separated from immediate survival. Children absorbed memory while traveling alongside adults, hearing stories connected to visible landmarks, watching repeated seasonal changes, and participating physically in communal routines tied to the land itself. Over time, memory became distributed across the environment so thoroughly that losing connection to certain places could weaken entire systems of knowledge. Forced migration, environmental destruction, colonization, climate shifts, or displacement sometimes disrupted oral traditions, not only because communities were separated from one another, but because they were separated from the landscapes, supporting collective memory through repeated experience. A route no longer traveled regularly became harder to remember accurately. Ecological knowledge weakened once familiar environmental patterns disappeared. Stories connected to sacred places gradually lost context when younger generations could no longer encounter those places directly themselves. Even today, many indigenous communities continue emphasizing the importance of land preservation, partly because cultural memory remains deeply connected to physical environment in ways modern societies often underestimate. Before writing existed, humans remembered through ongoing relationship with the world around them, carrying mental maps shaped by rivers, stars, mountains, seasons, and repeated journeys until memory no longer existed only inside people, but also inside the landscapes that helped keep those memories alive across time. The arrival of writing changed human memory not because the brain suddenly became different, but because information no longer needed to survive entirely inside living people, and this quiet transformation slowly altered the relationship between thought, knowledge, time, and forgetting in ways ancient humans could never fully anticipate. For thousands of years, memory had depended on repetition, ritual, storytelling, movement, and direct human continuity, because knowledge disappeared easily once voices stopped carrying it forward. Yet, writing introduced something new into human history, a form of external memory capable of remaining stable even after the individuals who created it were gone. At first, these early writing systems were limited and practical, often used for trade records, taxation, ownership, agriculture, or political administration rather than personal reflection or literature. But even simple marks pressed into clay or carved into stone represented a profound shift, because information could now exist independently from biological memory for the first time. A route could be recorded. A law could remain fixed. A transaction could survive beyond immediate conversation. A ruler's command no longer depended entirely on oral repetition traveling accurately from person to person. Historians generally believe some of the earliest known writing systems emerged in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, including cuneiform developed by the Sumerians, while other systems appeared independently in places such as ancient Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica. And although these writing traditions differed greatly, they all gradually changed the way human societies preserved continuity across generations. Before writing, memory had to remain active constantly or risk fading through neglect, but written symbols created the possibility of passive storage, allowing information to wait silently outside the human mind until needed again later. This may have reduced certain pressures oral cultures once placed on repetition and memorization because people no longer needed to carry every important detail internally with the same intensity as before. Some philosophers in the ancient world already sensed this transformation. In Plato's Dialogue Phaedrus, writing is described through a story in which the Egyptian king Thamus warns that written words might weaken human memory because people would rely on external marks instead of cultivating internal recall. And although this concern emerged thousands of years ago, modern societies still live inside the same tension between remembering internally and outsourcing memory into external systems. Cognitive scientists today sometimes describe writing as a form of cognitive extension because it expands human thinking beyond biological limitations, allowing information to accumulate across centuries with far greater stability than oral transmission alone could usually maintain. Complex mathematics, legal systems, scientific observation, philosophy, literature, and large-scale historical records became far easier to preserve once writing allowed ideas to survive independently from the fragile continuity of spoken memory. Yet something quieter may also have changed during this transition. Oral cultures often depended on deep listening, repetition, and close intergenerational relationships because knowledge moved directly between people through continual interaction, while written culture gradually allowed information to separate from immediate human presence. A person could learn from someone long dead. Knowledge could travel without storytellers. Memory became increasingly stored in objects rather than only inside communities. This transformation expanded human civilization enormously, but it also altered how humans experienced remembering itself. Modern people rarely need to memorize long histories, navigation routes, genealogies, or ceremonial language with the same precision required in oral societies because external systems now preserve those details automatically. And over time, attention shifted toward interpretation, comparison, and analysis instead of continuous memorization. Even today, humans still rely deeply on external memory systems, now expanded through books, photographs, recordings, computers, and digital networks storing more information than any individual mind could possibly carry alone. Yet, beneath these technologies, traces of the older world remain visible whenever stories, songs, rituals, or familiar places awaken memory more powerfully than written facts ever fully can. Writing changed civilization permanently, but it did not erase the ancient human mind that once survived by carrying entire worlds internally through memory alone. When writing began allowing memory to exist outside the human mind, the experience of remembering slowly changed in ways so gradual that no single generation could fully notice the transformation while it was happening. Because for most of human history, knowledge had survived only through living repetition, carried continuously between people, yet written symbols created something entirely new, information that could remain stable even in silence, waiting inside clay tablets, carved stone, papyrus, parchment, and eventually, books long after the original voices behind those words had disappeared. In oral societies, memory had to stay active to survive. Stories weakened when no one repeated them. Roots faded when no one traveled them. Histories changed slowly each time they passed through human recollection. But writing reduced this dependence on constant rehearsal by allowing knowledge to remain preserved externally, even when individuals forgot parts of it themselves. A person no longer needed to memorize every agreement, genealogy, law, or seasonal record internally, because marks on physical surfaces could now carry some of that burden independently. Historians studying early civilizations often note that writing first expanded most rapidly in areas requiring stable administration, trade, agriculture, taxation, and political organization, because large societies become difficult to coordinate when memory alone must manage growing amounts of information, and written records allowed humans to track grain supplies, property ownership, labor systems, and legal obligations with greater consistency across long periods of time. Yet beyond these practical uses, something deeper was also shifting quietly inside human cognition itself. Once information could survive outside the brain, people began relying less heavily on memorization for certain kinds of detail, gradually redistributing mental effort toward interpretation, comparison, planning, and analysis instead. Modern cognitive scientists sometimes describe writing as a form of external cognition because it expands human thought beyond the natural storage limits of biological memory, allowing individuals to work with far larger systems of knowledge than oral memory alone could usually maintain accurately. Complex mathematics became easier to preserve. Historical records stretched across centuries. Philosophical arguments could be revisited precisely instead of reconstructed imperfectly through oral recall. Scientific observation accumulated gradually rather than disappearing between generations. Writing allowed civilization to build upon earlier knowledge with a new level of stability, yet some thinkers throughout history worried that external memory might weaken internal memory at the same time. In Plato's Phaedrus, the invention of writing is described through a myth where King Thamus warns that written words could create the appearance of wisdom without true understanding, because people might stop training memory deeply once external symbols became available. And although modern societies often celebrate writing primarily as progress, this ancient concern still feels strangely recognizable now in a world where digital devices remember phone numbers, directions, appointments, conversations, and historical facts automatically on behalf of millions of people. The more external systems preserve for us, the less frequently certain forms of internal recall are exercised. Oral cultures once depended on close listening because forgetting carried greater risk. Repetition remained necessary because knowledge survived only while people continued performing it actively. Younger generations learned by staying physically near older generations for long periods of time, absorbing memory through relationship, ritual, and participation. Writing slowly changed this dynamic because information could now travel independently from the people who first carried it. A person could encounter ideas from distant places without meeting the original speaker. A text could outlive entire civilizations. Knowledge became increasingly detached from immediate human presence. In many ways, this transformation liberated human thought enormously, allowing ideas to survive war, migration, environmental collapse, and death more effectively than oral transmission alone often could. Yet it also altered humanity's emotional relationship with memory. Ancient humans once carried much larger portions of collective knowledge internally because they had no alternative. Modern humans live surrounded by external memory systems so vast that individuals no longer need to remember most information personally in order for civilization to retain it. Even now, traces of the older world remain inside the human mind whenever stories, songs, rhythms, familiar landscapes, or repeated rituals awaken memory more powerfully than written facts alone, quietly reminding modern people that long before words were stored on paper, human beings survived by carrying entire histories inside themselves. Writing may have weakened certain forms of human memory while strengthening entirely new forms of thought at the same time. And this tension has followed civilization for thousands of years because every external system humans create to preserve information changes the way the brain itself is used. Before writing existed, oral societies depended heavily on continuous memorization because survival, law, history, navigation, ritual, and identity all relied on living people carrying knowledge internally with enough accuracy to pass it forward across generations. Yet once written symbols allowed information to remain stable outside the mind, humans no longer needed to remember every detail personally in order for communities to preserve it collectively. This change likely reduced pressure on some forms of internal recall, especially long verbatim memorization that oral cultures often practiced extensively through repetition, rhythm, and storytelling. Ancient thinkers themselves noticed this possibility. In Plato's dialogue Phaedrus, the Egyptian king Thamus warns that writing could create forgetfulness because people would begin relying on external marks instead of strengthening memory within themselves. And although this criticism appeared more than 2,000 years ago, modern neuroscience suggests there may be partial truth inside the concern. Cognitive researchers have observed that humans tend to remember information differently once they believe it is stored safely elsewhere, a phenomenon sometimes described as cognitive offloading, where the brain reduces effort toward internal memorization when external systems become available to retrieve information later. Modern people experience this constantly through phones, search engines, digital calendars, and navigation systems that remember details automatically on behalf of the individual mind. Many people today no longer memorize phone numbers, routes, birthdays, or factual information with the same intensity previous generations once did, because external devices now perform those memory functions continuously. Yet describing writing simply as weakening memory would miss the deeper transformation that actually occurred, because external memory systems also expanded the possibilities of human thought enormously by freeing mental energy for other kinds of cognitive activity. Oral cultures often needed to dedicate large amounts of attention toward preserving and repeating existing knowledge accurately enough to prevent loss across generations, while written systems allowed information to remain stable independently from continuous rehearsal, making it easier for humans to compare ideas across long periods of time, develop complex mathematics, preserve scientific observations, organize large legal systems, and build philosophical arguments extending beyond what biological memory alone could easily sustain. Writing reduced certain memory burdens while increasing humanity's ability to accumulate knowledge collectively across centuries. Historians often note that large civilizations became far more administratively stable once written records allowed taxes, laws, trade agreements, agricultural planning, and political communication to survive beyond fragile oral transmission alone. At the same time, oral memory did not disappear entirely after writing emerged, because the human brain still responds deeply to story, rhythm, repetition, and emotional experience, much as it always has. Even literate societies continue using songs, rituals, narratives, and ceremonies to strengthen memory, because written symbols alone do not fully replace the older structures through which humans naturally remember most effectively. People still memorize poetry through rhythm more easily than plain information. Children still learn through repeated stories long before understanding abstract concepts fully. Emotional experiences still remain vivid decades later, while disconnected facts fade quickly. This suggests that writing changed the balance of human memory rather than replacing memory itself. Some forms of internal recall became less necessary once external storage existed, but other forms of cognition expanded dramatically because humans no longer needed to carry every detail internally all the time. In many ways, civilization traded one kind of memory for another. Oral cultures developed extraordinary capacities for repetition, listening, and communal recall because survival required it, while literate cultures gradually developed greater ability to preserve complexity externally across enormous stretches of time. Even now, modern humans live inside both worlds simultaneously. Phones remember information automatically, yet songs from childhood remain unforgettable. Digital maps guide travel, yet familiar landscapes still trigger emotional memory unexpectedly. Written history surrounds modern civilization, yet people continue searching for meaning through stories carried person to person, just as humans did long before writing existed. Perhaps memory was never truly weakened by writing so much as redistributed, with some parts of human remembering moving outward into symbols, while older patterns continued surviving quietly beneath the surface of modern life. Modern humans now live surrounded by outsourced memory systems so deeply integrated into daily life that many people rarely notice how much remembering has quietly moved outside the mind. Because phones carry contact numbers once memorized carefully, navigation systems guide routes once learned through repetition, search engines retrieve facts once stored internally, and digital archives preserve photographs, conversations, schedules, and records with almost no effort required from the individual brain. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It emerged gradually through writing, printing, libraries, photography, recording technologies, computers, and eventually networked digital systems that now store more information than any human being could personally remember across an entire lifetime. Yet, beneath this technological expansion, the human brain itself remains largely the same biological organ shaped through hundreds of thousands of years of oral existence before modern external memory appeared. Cognitive scientists today often describe this relationship through concepts such as distributed cognition or cognitive offloading, where humans rely on tools, environments, and social systems to reduce the burden placed on biological memory alone. A person may no longer memorize directions because a device can provide them instantly. Dates are stored inside calendars. Historical facts can be retrieved within seconds through digital search. Even ordinary conversations are increasingly preserved automatically through text messages, recordings, photographs, and online archives that continue remembering after human attention moves elsewhere. In many ways, modern civilization has created the most powerful external memory system humans have ever known, allowing information to survive with extraordinary stability across immense distances of space and time. Yet this convenience may also be changing the experience of memory itself in subtle ways. Some researchers have observed that people often remember where to find information more readily than the information itself once external storage becomes easily accessible, suggesting that the brain adapts naturally when reliable outside systems are available. Modern individuals may forget specific facts quickly, while retaining confidence that retrieval remains possible later through technology. This does not necessarily mean humans are becoming less intelligent, but it may indicate that memory is shifting function once again, just as it changed after writing first appeared thousands of years ago. Oral societies relied heavily on internal recall because forgetting carried immediate risk and external preservation barely existed. Modern societies rely increasingly on access rather than retention, because information can usually be recovered externally if needed. At the same time, external memory systems also influence attention. Ancient humans often needed sustained observation of landscapes, seasons, and social interaction because memory formed through repeated direct engagement with the world. Modern environments constantly compete for attention through rapid streams of incoming information, notifications, recordings, and digital stimuli that fragment focus into shorter intervals, and some cognitive researchers suggest that deep memory formation may weaken when attention itself becomes more divided and less repetitive over time. Yet despite these enormous technological changes, older forms of memory continue surviving beneath modern systems in ways many people still recognize instinctively. Songs remain easier to remember than disconnected facts. Familiar smells or places still trigger vivid recollections unexpectedly. Repeated family stories continue shaping identity across generations. Emotional experiences still remain durable inside memory long after ordinary information fades away. The human brain still responds strongly to rhythm, repetition, narrative, movement, and social connection much as it did in oral cultures thousands of years ago, suggesting that modern technology has expanded memory outward without fully replacing the older biological structures beneath it. In some ways, modern humans now live between two worlds simultaneously. One world stores memory externally through machines capable of preserving enormous amounts of information automatically. The other still depends on ancient emotional and sensory systems shaped long before writing existed. A digital archive may preserve photographs from childhood perfectly, yet a single familiar song can sometimes awaken memory more powerfully than thousands of stored images. Navigation apps may replace memorized routes, yet people still carry emotional attachment to landscapes connected to earlier periods of life. Modern civilization increasingly trusts machines to remember, but human beings themselves continue experiencing memory through feeling, repetition, place, and story, much as ancient humans once did beside fires, long before external memory systems existed at all. Modern humans may not necessarily remember less than ancient humans in a simple biological sense, but the kinds of memory used most heavily have changed dramatically as civilization shifted from oral survival cultures into societies surrounded by external storage systems, and this transformation can create the feeling that memory itself is weakening, even though the human brain continues adapting to new environments, much as it always has throughout history. Ancient people living before writing often depended on sustained internal recall because information could disappear permanently if living individuals failed to preserve it through repetition and direct transmission, while modern societies allow enormous amounts of information to remain safely stored outside the mind through books, recordings, digital archives, and network technology, reducing the need to memorize certain kinds of detail personally. Cognitive scientists studying memory have observed that humans naturally adapt their remembering strategies depending on what environments demand most strongly. When survival requires memorizing routes, seasons, oral histories, or ecological patterns, people become highly practiced at those forms of recall. When external systems reliably preserve information instead, the brain often shifts effort toward locating, organizing, interpreting, or managing access to knowledge rather than storing every detail internally. Modern individuals may therefore remember phone numbers, historical dates, navigation routes, or factual information less intensely than oral cultures once did. Yet at the same time, many people now manage far larger flows of information, social interaction, symbolic systems, and abstract knowledge than most ancient humans ever encountered in ordinary life. In some ways, memory has become less concentrated but more distributed across technological networks, supporting daily cognition continuously. Researchers sometimes describe this through the idea of cognitive offloading, where humans rely on tools and environments to reduce mental workload, and evidence suggests the brain often remembers how to retrieve information more readily than the information itself once reliable external access exists. A person may forget a fact quickly while remaining confident that it can be searched later if necessary. This pattern appears increasingly common in digital societies where retrieval often matters more than long-term memorization. Yet many older memory systems still remain deeply active beneath modern behavior. Emotional memories continue lasting far longer than neutral ones. Repeated stories remain easier to recall than disconnected information. Songs learned in childhood often survive decades with remarkable clarity. Familiar smells, landscapes, or rituals still trigger vivid recollections unexpectedly because the human brain continues responding strongly to sensory and emotional association, much as it did thousands of years ago. Modern people may rely less on memorizing practical survival details, but they still remember through narrative, repetition, rhythm, and emotional significance in fundamentally ancient ways. At the same time, some researchers worry that constant digital stimulation may affect attention itself, and attention plays a major role in whether memories form deeply enough to persist over time. Ancient humans often experienced long stretches of focused interaction with environments, tools, landscapes, stories, and communal routines repeated continuously across daily life, while modern environments frequently divide attention through rapid streams of notifications, media, multitasking, and fragmented information competing constantly for awareness. Studies in cognitive psychology suggest that fragmented attention can reduce deep encoding of memory because experiences processed superficially are often forgotten more quickly, which may partly explain why many people today feel mentally overloaded while simultaneously struggling to retain certain details clearly. Yet this does not necessarily mean human memory is declining universally. It may mean modern memory is adapting to conditions where external systems preserve information and rapid environmental change rewards flexibility, filtering, and selective attention more than exhaustive internal storage. Oral cultures optimized memory for continuity and survival across generations without writing. Modern societies optimize memory differently because civilization itself functions differently now. Even so, traces of older human memory remain visible everywhere. Families still repeat stories generation after generation. Communities still gather around ritual and shared emotion. Music still anchors memory with unusual strength. Places from childhood still carry emotional weight decades later. Humans continue remembering most deeply when experience becomes emotionally meaningful, socially reinforced, physically repeated, and tied to sensory life, suggesting that beneath modern technology, the ancient structure of human memory has never fully disappeared. It has simply learned to live alongside external systems that now remember on humanity's behalf more than ever before. Even after thousands of years of writing, technology, and external memory systems, the ancient human brain still remembers certain things with surprising strength, because the deeper structures shaping memory were formed long before modern civilization existed, during immense stretches of time when survival depended on emotion, repetition, movement, landscape, social bonding, and careful attention to environmental change. Modern humans may rely on devices to remember schedules, directions, names, and facts. Yet, beneath these newer habits, the brain still responds powerfully to the same patterns that helped ancient humans survive in oral worlds without writing. A familiar melody can suddenly awaken memories from decades earlier with unusual emotional clarity. A particular smell can return someone instantly to childhood without conscious effort. Repeated family stories continue shaping identity across generations, even when details change slightly over time. Places visited long ago can still trigger vivid sensations, emotions, and forgotten fragments of experience because memory remains deeply connected to sensory and emotional association rather than abstract information alone. Neuroscience suggests that emotionally significant experiences are encoded more strongly, partly because the brain prioritizes events linked to survival, belonging, danger, attachment, or meaning, and ancient humans lived inside environments where these forms of memory mattered constantly. Remembering which plants caused illness, which landscapes provided safety, which social bonds ensured protection, or which seasonal signs warned of environmental danger, carried immediate consequences for survival. So, over countless generations, the human brain became highly responsive to emotionally charged patterns connected to repeated experience. This ancient structure still shapes modern memory even when daily life looks completely different now. People often forget passwords quickly, yet remember songs from adolescence effortlessly. They may struggle to recall information read online only hours earlier, while still carrying emotional memories from childhood with remarkable vividness. This does not necessarily mean modern memory is failing. It may reflect the older priorities embedded deeply inside the brain itself. Humans remember most naturally when experiences become emotionally meaningful, socially reinforced, rhythmically repeated, physically embodied, or tied strongly to sensory environments, just as they were in oral cultures long before writing emerged. Even storytelling continues affecting memory in profoundly ancient ways, because narrative organizes information into sequences filled with emotion, movement, consequence, and social, meaning that the brain retains more easily than disconnected facts. This may explain why modern people still gather around films, music, rituals, traditions, and repeated communal experiences, despite living in societies surrounded by external storage systems capable of preserving information automatically. Technology can store data, but emotional memory still depends heavily on lived human experience. Cognitive scientists today sometimes distinguish between information availability and meaningful memory, because not everything preserved externally becomes integrated deeply into personal understanding or identity. A digital archive may contain thousands of photographs, yet only certain moments remain emotionally alive inside the mind. Search engines can retrieve endless information instantly, yet repeated stories told within families often shape human identity more deeply than vast amounts of accessible factual knowledge. Beneath modern civilization, humans still seem drawn toward the older conditions under which memory evolved most powerfully, including rhythm, repetition, physical presence, emotion, and social connection. This may also help explain why loneliness, fragmented attention, and constant digital stimulation can sometimes leave people feeling mentally unsettled despite unprecedented access to information, because the brain evolved not merely to process endless data, but to form meaningful memory through sustained relationships with people, places, stories, and repeated lived experience over time. Ancient humans carried memory through songs, rituals, landscapes, and collective storytelling because those methods aligned closely with how the brain naturally preserves important experiences. Modern systems changed civilization enormously, yet they did not erase these older foundations underneath human consciousness. Even now, when people sit quietly listening to familiar stories before sleep, feeling old emotions return through rhythm and voice, traces of the ancient oral world still remain alive inside the modern mind, reminding humanity that long before memory was written down, it survived through the fragile but deeply human act of feeling, repeating, and remembering together. Humans still need stories because the brain remembers life more naturally through narrative than through isolated information, and long before writing existed, stories became one of the most powerful tools ancient people used to preserve memory, identity, survival knowledge, emotional meaning, and social connection across generations. In a world where nothing could be permanently stored outside living minds, a story does more than deliver facts. It organizes experience into patterns involving people, movement, conflict, consequence, emotion, and time, allowing memory to follow structure rather than trying to hold disconnected details alone. Modern neuroscience suggests that the human brain often encodes narrative information more effectively because stories activate multiple systems simultaneously, including emotional processing, imagination, sensory association, prediction, and social understanding, and this may help explain why oral cultures depended so heavily on storytelling long before formal education systems or written archives existed. A child listening beside a fire to repeated stories about dangerous rivers, changing seasons, ancestors, or moral behavior would not simply memorize abstract instructions. The child would absorb emotionally meaningful patterns connected to memory through voice, rhythm, imagery, and repetition, making the information more durable across time. Ancient stories often preserved practical knowledge beneath symbolic or emotional structure because narrative made survival information easier to remember and transmit. Myths connected environmental events to memorable characters. Oral histories preserved migration routes inside repeated journeys. Animal stories carried warnings about behavior, cooperation, or danger. Ceremonial narratives reinforced group identity by reminding communities who they were and how earlier generations survived hardship. Anthropologists, studying oral traditions, have frequently observed that storytelling in these societies functions not merely as entertainment, but as a sophisticated memory technology, allowing large amounts of cultural knowledge to remain stable without writing. Even highly symbolic myths often contain ecological, social, or historical information encoded inside narrative form, because stories survive more effectively than detached instruction alone. This ancient relationship between memory and storytelling still shapes modern human experience in ways many people rarely notice consciously. Individuals often remember films, novels, songs, and personal stories more vividly than lists of factual information, because narrative organizes memory emotionally and temporally in ways the brain processes deeply. Family identities continue forming through repeated stories told across generations. Nations preserve continuity through historical narratives repeated publicly. Religious traditions maintain meaning through shared storytelling structures, surviving centuries or even millennia. Even personal memory itself often becomes narrative over time because humans naturally reconstruct life experiences into stories that create continuity between past and present. Cognitive psychologists have noted that autobiographical memory depends partly on narrative organization because people understand themselves through remembered sequences shaped into meaningful patterns rather than through isolated moments alone. This suggests storytelling is not simply something humans enjoy culturally, but something closely connected to how consciousness itself organizes experience. Before writing existed, this mattered enormously because stories allowed memory to remain alive through repeated social performance rather than fragile individual recall alone. A story spoken publicly could be corrected collectively, repeated rhythmically, adapted gradually, and emotionally reinforced through communal listening. Stories survived because humans wanted to hear them again. Information hidden inside narrative, therefore, traveled farther across generations than dry instruction often could. Even now, despite living inside civilizations overflowing with searchable data and external storage systems, humans continue returning instinctively towards stories when trying to communicate meaning deeply. Scientific discoveries become more memorable through narrative explanation. Historical events become emotionally understandable through personal accounts. Families remain connected through stories repeated over years. People still gather around films, books, music, rituals, and conversations because narrative continues shaping memory in fundamentally ancient ways beneath modern technology. Perhaps this is why storytelling has never disappeared despite every technological change humans have created, because stories do something older than information storage alone. They help the brain transform experience into memory that feels emotionally alive enough to remain part of human identity long after the moment itself has passed away. Stories become emotional memory because the human brain does not remember all experiences equally, and long before writing existed, humans survived partly by attaching important knowledge to feelings strong enough to remain alive inside memory long after ordinary details faded away. Modern neuroscience suggests that emotion plays a major role in determining which experiences become deeply encoded because emotionally significant events often activate brain systems involved in attention, learning, and long-term recall more intensely than neutral experiences do, and this may help explain why ancient storytelling traditions across many different cultures relied so heavily on emotion, rhythm, imagery, tension, loss, wonder, fear, belonging, or hope to preserve knowledge across generations without written records. A warning spoken plainly might be forgotten quickly, but a story carrying emotional weight could remain vivid for decades because the brain naturally prioritizes experiences connected to survival and social meaning. Ancient humans understood this intuitively through repeated experience, even without scientific language to describe it. Stories about dangerous journeys, famine, betrayal, courage, migration, ancestors, illness, or environmental disaster were not remembered only because the information itself mattered, but because the emotional structure surrounding the information strengthened recall. A child hearing repeated stories about harsh winters survived by earlier generations would absorb not just factual details, but emotional understanding tied to caution, resilience, fear, and communal identity, making those memories more durable over time. Anthropologists, studying oral cultures, have often observed that storytelling functions partly as emotional encoding for collective memory because stories preserving survival knowledge frequently contain dramatic or emotionally resonant elements, helping listeners remember important lessons more effectively. Even myths that appear symbolic or spiritual may carry ecological, social, or historical memory preserved through emotional narrative rather than detached explanation alone. This ancient connection between feeling and memory still shapes modern human life constantly. People often forget ordinary days almost immediately, yet emotionally charged moments remain vivid years later because memory is not designed primarily to store neutral information equally. It evolved partly to help humans prioritize experiences carrying survival or social importance. Cognitive psychologists have found that emotionally meaningful events are often remembered with greater intensity and detail than emotionally neutral ones, although memory remains imperfect and reconstructive rather than exact. A familiar song connected to adolescence may suddenly return powerful emotions decades later. A story heard repeatedly during childhood can continue shaping identity throughout adulthood. Family narratives passed through generations often survive, not because every detail remains historically precise, but because emotional meaning keeps them alive inside communal memory. Even modern entertainment industries still depend heavily on emotional storytelling because information alone rarely holds human attention for long, unless connected to feeling, conflict, empathy, suspense, or meaning. Before writing existed, this mattered enormously because oral memory depended on repeated human engagement. Stories survived when communities cared enough emotionally to continue telling them. A narrative carrying grief, wonder, danger, humor, or belonging moved through generations more successfully than flat instruction because emotional participation reinforced repetition. Ceremonies strengthened this process further by combining story with music, rhythm, movement, and communal experience, allowing memory to become socially and emotionally embodied at the same time. In many ways, ancient humans preserved knowledge, not by separating emotion from information, but by binding them together deliberately because the brain remembers emotionally meaningful experience more naturally than abstract instruction alone. Even now, surrounded by external memory systems storing endless amounts of data automatically, humans still remember most deeply through emotional narrative. A historical date may disappear quickly from memory, yet a personal story connected to that event can remain unforgettable. People continue searching for stories during grief, uncertainty, loneliness, celebration, and change because narrative helps transform isolated experiences into emotionally coherent memory. Beneath modern technology, the ancient brain still responds to storytelling much as it did thousands of years ago beside fires in oral societies, listening carefully not only for information, but for feeling strong enough to carry memory safely through time. Memory needs meaning because the human brain does not naturally preserve every experience with equal strength, and long before writing existed, humans learned, often unconsciously, that information survives longer when it feels connected to identity, survival, emotion, or purpose, rather than existing as isolated detail without human significance. Ancient oral societies depended on this principle constantly because they could not store large amounts of neutral information externally in stable written systems, which meant knowledge had to become meaningful enough for communities to repeat, remember, and carry forward across generations through lived experience itself. A fact disconnected from daily life could fade quickly. A story tied to danger, belonging, ancestry, ritual, or survival could remain alive for centuries because meaning strengthens attention, and attention strongly influences whether memory becomes durable over time. Modern neuroscience suggests that memory formation depends partly on the brain evaluating what matters enough to preserve, with emotionally or personally relevant experiences often receiving deeper cognitive processing than information perceived as unimportant, and this may explain why oral traditions around the world frequently embedded practical knowledge inside stories, ceremonies, symbols, and communal experiences that transformed information into something emotionally or socially valuable. Ancient humans did not memorize migration routes merely as abstract geography. Those routes were connected to ancestors, seasons, danger, survival, sacred identity, and repeated collective experience. Ecological knowledge became linked to stories about animals, spirits, weather, or past hardship because meaning helped memory remain active inside communities long enough to survive across generations. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have often observed that memory in these societies functions through significance rather than accumulation alone. Important knowledge survives because communities continue giving it emotional, social, and ceremonial value over time. Stories repeated for centuries usually endure not simply because they are factually informative, but because they help people understand themselves, their environment, their relationships, or their place inside existence itself. Even modern humans continue remembering, according to meaning, far more than raw information density. People often forget countless ordinary moments from daily life while retaining vivid memories connected to grief, love, fear, joy, embarrassment, belonging, or personal transformation, because the brain naturally organizes memory around emotional and narrative significance, rather than neutral recording alone. Cognitive psychology suggests that humans build autobiographical memory partly by constructing meaningful narratives, connecting experiences into coherent identity across time, which means memory is not simply storage but interpretation. Individuals remember what feels important to understanding who they are and how they relate to the world around them. This ancient structure remains deeply visible even inside technologically advanced societies overflowing with external information. Vast amounts of digital data are stored every second, yet most of it disappears from personal awareness almost immediately because information alone does not guarantee meaningful memory. A photograph saved automatically may never become emotionally important. Thousands of searchable facts may remain mentally distant if they carry no personal relevance. At the same time, a simple story told repeatedly by a grandparent can remain alive for decades because emotional meaning anchors memory more deeply than passive exposure alone. Before writing existed, this difference mattered enormously because oral cultures could not preserve everything equally. Communities had to prioritize what deserved repetition, ceremony, storytelling, and collective attention, and meaning acted as the filter determining what survived longest across time. Rituals preserved identity because they felt sacred. Stories survived because they carried emotional truth. Songs endured because they connected memory to feeling and social belonging. Knowledge remained alive when people believed it mattered enough to repeat again and again. Even now, modern humans continue searching constantly for meaning through stories, relationships, traditions, music, history, and memory. Because the brain still remembers most deeply when experience feels connected to something larger than isolated information itself. Perhaps this is why humans have never been satisfied with memory as simple storage alone, because beneath all technology and external systems, people still long for memories that feel emotionally alive, woven into identity strongly enough to remain part of who they are, long after the original moments have already disappeared into the past. What humans were really trying to preserve before writing existed may not have been information alone, but continuity itself, because memory in ancient societies was deeply connected to the fear that without repetition, storytelling, ritual, and shared experience, entire ways of understanding life could slowly disappear from the world forever. Modern people often think of memory as the storage of facts, dates, names, or events. Yet for most of human history, memory carried something much larger than isolated knowledge. It preserved relationships between generations. It maintained connection to ancestors, landscapes, survival practices, social identity, and emotional meaning. A community repeating stories beside a fire was not simply entertaining itself during the night. It was quietly protecting continuity against forgetting, in a world where silence could erase history completely once the people carrying it were gone. Ancient humans understood, even without scientific language, that memory was fragile. Elders died. Landscapes changed. Communities migrated. Languages shifted slowly over time. Wars, famine, disease, and environmental collapse could break the chain between generations unexpectedly, leaving younger people disconnected from knowledge to older generations once considered essential. This may explain why oral cultures often place such enormous value on repetition, ceremony, and storytelling, because preserving memory meant preserving identity itself. A migration story was not merely a story. It explained where a people came from. A ritual was not only symbolic performance. It renewed continuity between the living and the dead. Songs carried emotional memory across generations because melody helped communities feel connected to earlier lives they could never personally witness. Anthropologists studying oral traditions frequently note that these systems preserve far more than practical survival information alone. They also preserve emotional frameworks, helping communities understand suffering, belonging, morality, kinship, and the meaning of existence within larger patterns of time and nature. Before writing, memory functioned almost like a living bridge, holding generations together across the instability of human life. Modern neuroscience and cognitive psychology suggest that human beings naturally construct identity through memory because the brain organizes personal experience into narratives, creating continuity between past and present, and ancient societies depended on this process collectively as well as individually. Communities survived partly by maintaining shared memory strong enough to preserve cooperation, trust, cultural meaning, and social cohesion over time. A people forgetting their stories risked forgetting who they were. A family losing connection to ancestral memory could lose part of its identity. Knowledge mattered not only because it helped survival materially, but because it helped human beings feel connected to one another across generations larger than any individual lifespan. Even after writing emerged, many older forms of remembering continued because external storage alone could not fully preserve emotional continuity. Written records can archive facts, but they cannot entirely replace the feeling carried through repeated stories told by familiar voices across many years. A photograph can preserve an image, yet not fully recreate the lived emotional memory surrounding that moment. Digital systems may now store immense amounts of information automatically, but modern humans still return instinctively toward rituals, storytelling, music, family traditions, and shared experiences when trying to preserve what matters most deeply, because meaning survives most strongly when memory remains emotionally alive inside human relationships, rather than existing only as passive data. This may be why people continue feeling drawn toward old songs, childhood places, repeated stories, and ancestral traditions even inside technologically advanced societies, because beneath modern external memory systems, the ancient human desire for continuity has never disappeared. Humans were never trying only to remember information, they were trying to preserve connection against the passage of time itself. Perhaps this is why memory has always carried both comfort and sadness together, because every act of remembering quietly acknowledges that human lives are temporary, yet also expresses the hope that something meaningful can still continue traveling forward after individual voices finally become silent. Forgetting frightens humans because memory is deeply connected to identity, continuity, and the feeling that a life remains real even after moments have passed away. And long before writing existed, ancient people already lived with the quiet awareness that losing memory could mean losing connection not only to practical knowledge, but to ancestors, relationships, meaning, and even parts of themselves. In oral societies, this fear carried immediate consequences because memory was fragile in ways modern people rarely experience fully today. If stories stopped being repeated, they could disappear permanently. If younger generations failed to learn migration routes, rituals, or ecological knowledge before elders died, entire systems of understanding might vanish beyond recovery. Forgetting was not abstract. It could reshape the survival and identity of whole communities. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have often noted how strongly many societies emphasize remembrance through ritual, storytelling, naming traditions, songs, burial practices, and repeated ceremonies, because memory helped preserve continuity between generations in a world without permanent external storage. A name spoken repeatedly kept a person socially alive after death. An ancestral story connected the living to those who came before them. Ceremonies renewed memory collectively, so forgetting would not slowly dissolve communal identity over time. Even today, traces of this ancient fear remain deeply present beneath modern life, because human beings continue resisting disappearance through memory in countless quiet ways. Families preserve photographs, recipes, letters, traditions, recordings, and stories because people want something meaningful to remain after time passes. Communities build monuments and memorials because remembering feels emotionally important beyond practical usefulness alone. Individuals often fear illnesses affecting memory not only because of cognitive decline itself, but because memory feels inseparable from personal identity. Modern neuroscience supports this connection strongly because autobiographical memory helps humans maintain a stable sense of self across time. People understand who they are partly through remembered continuity, linking past experience to present awareness, and when memory becomes fragmented or inaccessible, the feeling of identity itself can become unstable. This may explain why forgetting can feel emotionally unsettling even in ordinary situations. Losing an old photograph may create sadness disproportionate to the object itself because the memory attached to it feels threatened. Returning to a childhood place that no longer exists can create disorientation because physical environments often anchor emotional continuity inside the mind. A familiar song, unexpectedly awakening forgotten feelings, may produce both comfort and grief simultaneously because memory reminds people how much time has already passed. Ancient humans likely experienced similar emotions even without modern psychological language because the desire to preserve continuity appears deeply rooted across cultures and throughout history. Yet forgetting also remains unavoidable. Human memory has never been perfect storage. Cognitive psychology shows that memory is reconstructive rather than fixed, meaning recollections change subtly through emotion, reinterpretation, repetition, and time itself. Oral traditions shifted gradually across generations. Personal memories soften or rearrange details. Languages disappear. Stories evolve. Entire civilizations vanish, leaving only fragments behind. Humans have always lived inside this tension between the wish to preserve and the reality that forgetting eventually touches everything. Perhaps this is one reason writing, monuments, art, music, ritual, and storytelling became so emotionally important across human history, because they represent attempts to hold continuity against impermanence, even while knowing permanence can never be complete. Modern technology now stores more information than any previous civilization could imagine, yet the emotional fear surrounding forgetting has not disappeared because external storage alone cannot fully replace lived human memory. A digital archive may preserve images forever, but it cannot entirely recreate the feeling of being present in a moment already gone. Information can survive while emotional experience fades. Names can remain recorded long after the voices behind them are silent. Beneath all systems of preservation, humans still seem to understand something ancient and difficult, that memory matters because life itself passes quickly, and remembering becomes one of the few ways people continue carrying fragments of one another forward through time after the original moments can no longer return again. After everything humans have created to preserve memory, from stories spoken beside ancient fires to libraries, monuments, photographs, recordings, computers, and vast digital networks storing more information than any civilization before could imagine, one quiet question still remains unresolved beneath all of it: whether humans truly fear forgetting itself, or whether they fear the possibility that a life may pass through the world without leaving enough meaning behind to be remembered at all. Long before writing existed, people already struggled against disappearance through repetition, ritual, song, storytelling, and collective memory. Because human lives are brief, while time continues moving forward endlessly, and memory became one of the few ways individuals and communities could extend continuity beyond the limits of a single lifespan. Ancient oral cultures preserved stories not only to store practical knowledge, but to keep ancestors emotionally present inside communal life after death. Names were repeated so lives would not vanish entirely into silence. Rituals renewed memory, because remembering helped people feel connected across generations larger than themselves. Modern societies still continue many of these same behaviors in different forms. Families preserve photographs, people record voices, communities build memorials. Entire civilizations archive history constantly through technology that attempts to resist loss on a scale ancient humans could never have imagined. Yet despite these enormous systems of preservation, forgetting still remains unavoidable. Memories fade naturally over time, details change, stories shift with each generation, languages disappear. Digital archives themselves may one day vanish or become unreadable. Even neuroscience suggests that human memory was never designed to function as perfect recording, but as a flexible and reconstructive system shaped continuously by emotion, attention, meaning, and present experience. People do not remember everything equally because the brain constantly filters reality according to what feels emotionally or socially important enough to preserve. This may be why some small moments remain vivid for decades, while enormous stretches of ordinary life disappear almost completely from conscious recall. A familiar voice heard once before, sleep can remain emotionally alive long after countless routine conversations fade away. A simple story repeated in childhood may survive longer than years filled with forgettable information. The ancient human brain still seems to understand that memory matters most when it carries meaning rather than sheer quantity alone. Perhaps this is why storytelling, music, ritual, and emotional connection continue surviving even in civilizations overflowing with external storage systems. Information can be archived endlessly, yet humans still long for memories that feel alive inside relationships and lived experience, rather than existing only as preserved data. Anthropologists, neuroscientists, historians, and psychologists all approach memory differently, yet together they reveal a similar truth, that remembering has never been merely technical storage inside the brain. Memory shapes identity, belonging, continuity, emotion, culture, and the feeling that human existence remains connected across time. Before writing existed, humans protected memory collectively because forgetting carried enormous consequences. After writing emerged, memory expanded beyond biological limits into symbols and technology. Yet the emotional structure beneath remembering changed far less than people sometimes assume. Humans still gather around stories. They still repeat rituals. They still attach memory to songs, landscapes, voices, and relationships. They still fear disappearance. They still hope something meaningful can continue after they are gone. Perhaps the deepest question was never how humans remembered before writing existed, but why remembering became so important to human beings in the first place. Maybe memory is not only about preserving the past, maybe it is also about resisting the loneliness of impermanence by allowing fragments of human experience to travel forward through other minds long after individual lives have ended. And if every civilization eventually fades, every archive decays, every language changes, and every memory slowly softens with time, then somewhere far beyond all systems humans have ever built to remember, another quiet question continues, waiting without a final answer. What does it truly mean for something to be remembered at all?